A fun cave trip turns into a terrible disaster when 7 men explore a mysterious hole in a big underground room. The group of 7 men need to get out of this cave fast before rainwater floods the way out and traps them inside. This is the scary Peak Cavern tragedy. 3 cave explorers were deep inside Peak Cavern when they found a huge room filled with beautiful rock shapes. Shiny crystal rocks hung from the ceiling and amazed the men with what they saw. While looking around the room, they found a small dark hole in the ground and had to take a look inside. The hole was only 30 inches by 18 inches wide. It was not a big opening, but small holes like this have led to amazing new cave discoveries many times before. So they tied a rope and went down the narrow hole. After twisting and turning through a tight space, they saw a deeper shaft going down below. But they could not see where it ended or what was waiting in the darkness below. The men went back home that day and planned to return later. They had no idea that their next trip would create a situation so scary that expert rescue workers would give up trying to help. Something dangerous was hiding in that narrow shaft that would change everything. What looked like a harmless hole in the ground was about to become a deadly trap that would shock cave explorers everywhere. Peak Cavern sits deep in England's Peak District, near the quiet village of Castleton in Derbyshire. This massive cave system has attracted explorers for centuries, with its enormous entrance chamber that can fit an entire cathedral inside. But in March 1959, 3 experienced cavers were about to discover something that had remained hidden for thousands of years. The 3 men had been exploring the deepest sections of the cave, far beyond where tourist groups ever venture. They had crawled, squeezed, and swam through difficult passages for over 2 hours to reach a spectacular chamber decorated with crystal formations. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and the men stopped to admire the natural beauty that few human eyes had ever seen. As they explored this magnificent chamber, one of the cavers noticed something unusual. In the floor of the cavern was a small, dark opening. The hole was only 30 inches by 18 inches, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. Most people would have glanced at it and moved on. But cavers think differently. They know that some of the greatest underground discoveries in history have started with tiny holes just like this one. The 3 friends couldn't resist taking a closer look. They tied a safety rope around their smallest team member, 17-year-old Bob Toogood, and carefully lowered him into the opening. What Bob found below was both exciting and mysterious. The small entrance led to a narrow shaft that twisted downward in a corkscrew pattern. He could see it continued for at least 40 feet, but the twisting walls made it impossible to see where it ended. The discovery was thrilling, but the men knew they weren't prepared for a proper exploration. They needed more equipment, more people, and a better plan. So they carefully marked the location and made arrangements to return in a few weeks with a full expedition team. They had no idea they were planning what would become one of the most tragic accidents in British caving history. On Sunday, March 22, 1959, 7 cavers gathered at the entrance to Peak Cavern. The weather was cold and damp, with threatening clouds overhead that promised rain later in the day. The night before, the British Speleological Association had held their regular meeting in Castleton, and word of the mysterious shaft had spread among the local caving community. Among the excited group was 20-year-old Neil Moss, a brilliant philosophy student from Oxford University's prestigious Balliol College. Neil was tall and lean, standing 6 feet 3 inches, with the kind of thin build that was perfect for squeezing through tight underground spaces. He had heard about the discovery and was eager to be part of what might be a significant find. The team included Peter Crabtree, one of the original discoverers, along with Bob Toogood and several other experienced cavers. They had spent weeks planning this expedition, carefully selecting equipment and discussing strategies. They brought rope ladders, safety ropes, emergency supplies, and their carbide lamps, the best lighting technology available in 1959. These acetylene lamps were nicknamed Stinkies because of their distinctive smell, but they provided reliable light that could last for days on a single fuel canister. The lamps gave good general illumination for walking through cave passages, though they weren't as focused as modern flashlights. More importantly, while they did consume oxygen, they didn't produce dangerous carbon monoxide like some other lighting options. The men suited up in their goon suits, waterproof coveralls that would protect them from the wet, muddy conditions they would face underground. They checked their equipment one final time, went over their plan, and entered the cave. None of them could have imagined the horror that awaited them in the depths below. The path to reach the mysterious chamber was one of the most challenging routes in Peak Cavern. The men started in the main show chamber near the entrance, a huge space with permanent lighting installed for tourists. But beyond this comfortable area lay nearly 2,000 feet of some of the most difficult underground passages in England. The first challenge was 300 feet of hiking through boulder-strewn tunnels of varying sizes. The men had to wade through chest-deep water while the cave ceiling hung just inches above their heads. The narrow gap between the water and the rock ceiling left barely enough room to breathe, creating a claustrophobic experience that would make most people panic. Next came the infamous Mucky Ducks Passage, where high water levels forced the cavers to duck under dangerous rock overhangs. The passage was incredibly slippery and muddy, covering every man in a thick coating of cave mud that would actually help them squeeze through tight spaces later in the journey. After 600 more feet of difficult travel, the men reached Pickering's Passage, where the cave narrowed dramatically. For the next 250 feet, they had to crawl on their hands and knees through a tunnel barely big enough to fit their bodies. The walls pressed in from all sides, and loose rocks and mud made every movement treacherous. Halfway through this crawling section was the notorious eye hole, a constriction so tight that cavers had to trust there would be room to turn around somewhere ahead. The thick mud covering their bodies helped them slide through the opening, but it also made it nearly impossible to find good handholds or footing. Whoever had first squeezed through this space must have been incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. All 7 men made it through the eye hole and continued through the remaining passage until they reached the final obstacle, a deep, cold pool that had to be crossed by swimming. The water was shockingly cold, and the men had to pull themselves through while weighted down by their equipment and thick mud coating. After this exhausting underground journey, the team finally reached the decorated chamber where the mysterious shaft waited for them. They were tired, muddy, and cold, but excited about what they might discover in the unexplored depths below. The plan seemed straightforward enough. The team would lower their rope ladder through the narrow opening and down into the shaft below. This would create a safe route for someone to climb down and explore whatever lay at the bottom. Bob Toogood, who had made the original reconnaissance trip, was prepared to go down again. But as the men gathered their equipment and peered into the dark hole, Neil Moss stepped forward with a different suggestion. His tall, thin frame might be better suited for the job of pushing the bulky rope ladder through the tight corkscrew section they knew existed below. It seemed logical. Neil's height and reach could help position the 75-foot ladder properly in the lower shaft. Bob secured the rope ladder to a strong point near the opening and prepared to follow Neil down. The initial descent was tight but manageable. Neil squeezed through the opening and began working his way down the narrow passage. Behind him, Bob waited for the signal that the ladder was properly positioned. As Neil reached the corkscrew section, the passage became much more challenging. He had to twist his body in uncomfortable ways, turning his shoulders in one direction while rotating his hips the other way. Every movement had to be careful and deliberate. One wrong twist could wedge him permanently in the narrow space. Neil could see his feet and legs emerging from the corkscrew into what appeared to be a larger shaft below. There was a small amount of clearance above his head, just enough for him to lean forward and peer down between his legs to see where he was heading. What he saw was both exciting and terrifying. The shaft continued much deeper than they had expected, disappearing into darkness far below. But it was also much narrower than it had appeared from above. The opening below the corkscrew was only about 18 inches wide, barely enough space for even Neil's thin frame. Still, he had come this far, and Bob was waiting above him. There was no easy way to turn back now. Neil began pushing the bunched-up rope ladder ahead of him as he entered the narrow elliptical shaft. The mass of rope and metal rungs was difficult to maneuver in such a confined space, and it kept getting caught on the rough walls. Neil used his feet to kick the ladder free from snags while maintaining his grip with one hand and feeling along the walls with the other. As he worked his way deeper into the shaft, Neil encountered an unexpected obstacle. A loose boulder was partially blocking the passage ahead. In the cramped confines of the narrow hole, Neil couldn't simply reach down and move the rock out of the way. He needed to find a better position. Feeling around the walls, Neil discovered a small alcove or indentation in the rock. He carefully maneuvered his body into this tiny space, which gave him just enough room to bend down and work on moving the boulder. The effort was exhausting after the long journey to reach this point, and the uncomfortable position made it even harder. Neil managed to dislodge the boulder, but his success created an even bigger problem. The rock tumbled away from him and wedged itself in the shaft below, taking the tangled rope ladder with it. The ladder was now pinned against the wall of the shaft, twisted into an impossible position. When Neil tried to climb back up, he found himself in serious trouble. The boulder and ladder were blocking his path, and the narrow shaft gave him no room to maneuver. His broad shoulders, which had barely fit through the elliptical opening on the way down, were now wedged against the walls. Every attempt to push upward only wedged him tighter. After several minutes of struggling, Neil called up to his teammates with words that would haunt them forever. "I'm stuck. I can't move an inch." The excitement of discovery had instantly transformed into a life-threatening emergency. Bob Toogood immediately tried to reach Neil by climbing down through the corkscrew section. But when he peered into the lower shaft, he could only see the top of Neil's helmet far below. It was clear that Neil was trapped in the narrowest part of the passage, and getting him out would require help from the surface. Bob climbed back up and gathered the rest of the team. Together, they tried to pull Neil up using the rope ladder as a lifeline. At first, they felt some movement. Neil seemed to rise a foot or two. But then the ladder became taut and wouldn't budge any further. The boulder below had created such a tight jam that no amount of pulling could free the equipment. Worse yet, the partial movement had actually made Neil's situation more dangerous. He was now wedged even tighter in the narrow shaft, with his feet dangling uselessly above a ladder rung he couldn't reach. The smooth walls of the passage gave him no way to gain leverage or help in his own rescue. The team tried everything they could think of. They attempted to lower additional ropes to Neil, hoping to loop them around his body and pull him up directly. But the safety ropes they had brought weren't designed for this kind of rescue. The sharp edges of the rock kept cutting through the rope, and each attempt ended in failure. After more than an hour of unsuccessful rescue attempts, the men realized they needed outside help. Bob Toogood volunteered to make the dangerous journey back to the surface alone, leaving the others to continue working on freeing Neil. Bob's solo trip to the surface was a nightmare of mud, water, and tight squeezes. He had to navigate every challenging passage they had overcome as a team, but now he was alone, exhausted and racing against time. The eye hole, the Mucky Duck's passage, the underwater sections. Every obstacle seemed twice as difficult when he was worried about Neil trapped below. When Bob finally reached the surface after 2 grueling hours, he immediately contacted local farmers and called the police. Word spread quickly through the small caving community, and soon cavers from across the region were dropping everything to come help with the rescue. Bob collected strong nylon rope from nearby Whiteleaf Farm and began the exhausting journey back underground. Carrying hundreds of feet of heavy rope through the tight passages was incredibly difficult, but he pushed himself to move as quickly as possible. Every minute counted. Meanwhile, underground, the situation was becoming more desperate. Neil had been trapped in the narrow shaft for several hours, and his teammates could hear the exhaustion and fear in his voice. They continued trying different rescue techniques, but nothing was working. The space was simply too narrow and the angle too awkward. When Bob returned with the new rope, the team hoped they finally had what they needed to pull Neil free. Bob was small enough to squeeze down close to where Neil was trapped, and his job was to get a rescue rope properly positioned around Neil's body. But as Bob descended into the lower shaft, something terrifying happened. He began to feel dizzy and weak. His vision started to blur, and he had trouble thinking clearly. Within minutes, he was struggling to stay conscious and had to be pulled back to safety immediately. The rescue team had discovered something that made Neil's situation infinitely worse. The narrow shaft was filling with carbon dioxide from Neil's own breathing. In the confined space, his exhaled breath had nowhere to go and was building up around his head like a deadly invisible cloud. Ron Peters, a small, compact caver who stood only 5 feet tall, volunteered to try reaching Neil by going down head first. The idea was that his smaller size and different angle might allow him to get close enough to position a rescue rope. But within minutes of reaching Neil's position, Peters also began to feel the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning. He managed to call for help before losing consciousness and had to be pulled up quickly. The discovery sent shockwaves through the rescue team. Not only was Neil physically trapped in an impossible position, but the air around him was becoming toxic to anyone who tried to help. Several more rescuers attempted to reach him, but each one was overcome by the deadly gas and had to be pulled to safety. The team immediately sent word to the surface requesting oxygen tanks and emergency medical equipment.
Time after time they tried, only to find that courage was not enough. And still Neil was breathing. Perhaps the oxygen cylinders would keep him alive and give the rescuers time to make new attempts.
Hospital workers responded by sending dozens of oxygen cylinders, which had to be carried through all the same difficult passages the original team had navigated. Volunteers formed human chains to pass the heavy tanks through underwater sections, tight crawls, and muddy squeezes. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, making the already dangerous cave passages even more treacherous. Water levels in the flooded sections were rising, and the mud was becoming deeper and more slippery. Each trip to carry equipment took longer and became more dangerous. When the oxygen equipment finally reached Neil's location, rescuers fed a tube down the narrow shaft and began pumping fresh air toward him. The hope was that this would clear the carbon dioxide and allow both Neil and potential rescuers to breathe safely. But the physics of the situation worked against them. The narrow shaft acted like a chimney with the heavy carbon dioxide. The tragic story of Neil Moss reminds us how quickly adventure can turn deadly and why we must learn from these heartbreaking incidents. What are your thoughts on this cave disaster? Could it have been prevented with today's technology? Share this story with others and subscribe to stay informed about more tragic incidents that changed safety forever.